Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Dill, what are the reasons that you can be optimistic that this Florida State program gets back on track in 2025? And I want to preface this conversation with, this is certainly not the fellas getting up here and saying Florida State's going to win a national championship in the 2025 year, but this is the boys coming up here and saying, look, Florida State took a lot of steps to get this program kind of going back to where it belongs, not only from a personnel standpoint, but from a coaching staff standpoint as well. I think there were the necessary steps Mike Norvell had to take, and there are a lot of reasons to believe that this is going to be a brand new football team from the team that we saw in 2024. What are those reasons? Want to get into them over the next couple of minutes before we get into it, as always, to the Florida State fans. Look, to me, this spring practice window for Florida State going to be an absolute blast. And something I always appreciate from Mike Norvell is he's quite transparent about how his program operates. We are going to get a lot of intel, so to speak, in terms of what's going on in spring practice. A lot of position battles, a lot of new football players, brand new coaching staff. It's going to be a really fun next couple of weeks talking this program. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Much more importantly, to the Florida State fans, let it fly in the comment section. This is kind of just helping me out here. What are the expectations for this Florida State team in 2025? What is the record, and what do you need to see to consider a successful 2025 year? I have a feeling we're going to get a lot of different answers. Kind of want to get a feel for where the Florida State fans are kind of sitting going into 2025. Dill, without further ado, let's get into it. I think in both our opinions, right, we just sat down for the last hour and a half, talked about, hey, what are the reasons to be optimistic about this football team going into 2025? It starts with the revamped coaching staff. Look, the players last year, you missed on some transfer portal additions. You missed at some high school recruiting spots as well. That's kind of what resulted in as ugly as it got. The coaching staff wasn't good enough, and we kind of knew that. Dill, when you look at this new coaching staff coming in, where are the positions, who are the coaches that you think bring the most value to Florida State going into 2025 here?
Honestly, it's probably Herb Hand and Tony White if I had to rank them, because I think
Yeah.
everyone knows that basically the downfall of this Florida State program was their inability to develop anybody, it felt like, from the high school path through their offensive line and then to being good football players. Like, they had years to do it. It was a really veteran experienced group last year. And the fact that they put together the performance they put together, and the fact that they tried so hard to get different personnel groupings and nothing worked, I'd probably start with the offensive line coach, because that was you don't even need to be a football guy necessarily to see that was a very big problem for them.
It was probably, and we're going to talk about the offensive line, because not only do they bring in Herb Hand, they completely revamped this offensive line from a personnel standpoint as well. We'll get into the offensive line. It was a disaster, but Dill, I'm kind of with you. Look at the linebackers. And this is something Tony White, I think, is going to have a massive impact on. Yeah, the linebackers from a personnel standpoint, they weren't good enough. When we were talking about this team in the month of August, talking about, hey, what are the question marks we have for Florida State? The linebacker position was kind of that number one question mark. It was clearly a question. It was clearly bad for Florida State in 2024, not only because your players probably just weren't good enough and you haven't recruited that position well enough, but man, they were lost. They were lost out of really bad run fits. They were not athletic enough to match up in man coverage when they had their opportunities to. Tony White, you feel so good about just getting that linebacker room at least coached up the right way. Do I think the personnel is great in the linebacker room heading into 2025? No, I don't. But I do trust that Tony White can get the most out of these guys, which certainly wasn't happening in the 2024 year. Dill, I want to go to number two, and this is probably for me. You wanted to lead with the coaching staff, and I don't totally disagree with you. I wanted to lead with the offensive line. The Florida State fans, and many of y'all who listen to the boys and rock with us, I get up here all the time and say it's impossible to build an offensive line through the transfer portal. And look, it's very hard to do, but dang nabbit, Mike Norvell and the Florida State Seminoles, they might have just done it going into 2025. This was an extremely impressive offensive line haul. And Dill, what stands out to me the most here is there's no projections. We've seen a lot of these guys for multiple years at the Power 4 level play really good football. Starting with Gunnar Hansen from Vanderbilt, 3-year starter in the SEC, going into his 4th year starting at the Power 4 level. Go to the other side with Micah Pettis. He's also going into his 4th year starting at the Power 4 level, 3 years of starting experience in the SEC. Luke Pettibon, he was an all ACC caliber center at Wake Forest, really the only non-proven commodity on this offensive line. And I say that not really being true is Adrian Medley. He's only started 1 year at UCF. Guess what? Herb Hand, Gus Malzahn, they wouldn't have brought him over to Florida State if they didn't think he could play. And Richie Leonard, we know can play. I mean, he got hurt last year. He's probably the best offensive lineman until he got hurt. Multi-year starter at Florida. This is an offensive line that you know what you're getting. Do I think it's going to be a top 5 offensive line in the country? But it certainly is not going to be as bad as it was in 2024, where you look at the numbers, Bill. I mean, this is, we all know it's bad, but these numbers are insane. 2.6 yards per carry for Florida State last year running the football. That was 132nd, dead last in the Power 5. Or Power 4 now, excuse me. Sack rate. They were giving up sacks on 12% of dropbacks. That was 131st. Dead last in the Power 4. This offensive line is going to be brand new. And it's going to be significantly better. And at the very least, you know it's going to be a solid unit in 2025. And that's where it starts for me going into the 2025
They really,
year.
I feel like, pulled the wool over everyone's eyes with like, oh, they had such an experienced group last year. But the issue is none of them played particularly great football. Even like the guys like who were Florida State guys, if you will, the Washingtons, the Smiths. I think a lot of their poor play was covered up by you had a quarterback.
Yes, agreed with this. 100% agree with that.
Like kind of Houdini-act back there. And then you had a running back in Benson who could hit big plays. So it's not like they could consistently get yards and operate an effective offense, but they did have some real high-end stars at both the running back spot and, frankly, the wide spot and quarterback spot that allowed them to cover up for some deficiencies. But, like, man, if you just, like, watch them down in, down out, they were a really weak unit in 2023 too, frankly. And I think we were all convinced, like, oh, yeah, something's going to change. They're going to get better going into the next year. Obviously, that wasn't the case. They performed just probably as poorly, but like you just didn't have the talent around them.
Go back to how we talked about this team in 2023 as well. It was such a good football team in 2023, but we always said, what was that one unit that we thought might have been holding them back a little bit? It was the offensive line. I think you make a great point. We kind of got tricked because of how good Jordan Travis was, not only as a quarterback in general, but how good he was getting outside the pocket and avoiding sacks. We kind of got tricked in terms of like, oh, this offensive line's getting better when it really wasn't. Then you get a statue coming in DJU, and it really gets exposed. I'm totally with you that we kind of got fooled that Alex Atkins in this offensive line was going in the right direction when it wasn't. And when he didn't have Jordan Travis back there, it got ugly, and it got ugly quickly. I will say this, though. This kind of does highlight what needs to change with Florida State as a program as a whole. Because you look at, if you have to go to the transfer portal year after year to grab 4 starting offensive linemen, you ain't going to be able to do that. Mike Norvell did a really good job this year. You can't count on this every single offseason.
That's why I say the coaching staff changes, like certain places. The defensive coordinator, I think, was huge. The offensive line coach might be even bigger than the offensive coordinator, frankly. Because, that you hope to see a better pipeline built up, because at the end of the day, they didn't really have homegrown talent from their offensive line play. Like, they could cobble it together with some decent transfers, but they never had guys who came up through the Florida State pipeline and who played particularly good.
I'm really interested to hear what we hear from like a Lucas Simmons or a Jonathan Daniels.
Yeah, honestly, I'd like to probably see one of them grab a spot. Like, those are really talented players coming out. Like, again, I mean, a guy like Medley and Pettis, like, those are solid players. Like, they'll be better than what Florida State had, but those are not first team all SEC, all ACC guys in my mind. Like, there's
probably, so I know where you're coming from. I would not expect that, and I don't think that would be an indictment on Herb Hand year one if Lucas Simmons and Jonathan Daniels don't start. But what I meant to say here is, one, this kind of resembles like the problem is like the guys out of the high school ranks. There's just not a ton of guys that have stepped up that Florida State recruited on the offensive line out of high school. I would love to see Lucas Simmons, Jonathan Daniels take that step. So when 2026 comes around, you start looking at your offensive line saying, yeah, we got guys that can come in and fill up. Number 3, quarterback play, giving a high floor. Dill, 12 months ago, what was the only conversation we had with DJU for about 8 months straight was, what's the ceiling look like former 5-star guy that showed some decent things at Oregon State in the 2023 year before he came over to Florida State. And we were selling ourselves on just the ceiling, fully just kind of ignoring that we've seen some low lows from DJU as well, especially when it's not perfect around him. Thomas Castellanos is kind of the complete opposite conversation where it's like, look, I ain't going to get up here and say Thomas Castellanos is going to go win a Heisman or go be a first-round NFL draft pick, because he's not. But he is a guy that gives you, especially from an athleticism standpoint, pretty high floor. Things don't need to be perfect around him for Thomas Castellanos to go out and make plays. And let's just be quite frank. I'm not saying Thomas Castellanos is Jordan Travis, but he's much closer to Jordan Travis than a guy like DJU was. The most overrated and overstated thing about DJU was his mobility. He really wasn't. I mean, yeah, when he's going right downhill at you 250 pounds, yeah, he can make something happen. But in terms of his escapability and creativity and playmaking, getting outside the pocket, it just didn't exist. And I think we kind of fooled ourselves to thinking it did exist. What fires me up the most is Thomas Castellanos can be a really good quarterback if you build this offense around him. And he's a quarterback that, because of the athlete that he is, he gives you a relatively high floor, in my opinion.
And that's where it ties in with their offensive line playing good ball, because I do think a big part of this is them having a better run scheme. And again, Thomas Castellanos certainly helps with that. He's a good athlete in his own right. I think you go back to the Boston College tape when he was made the focal point of their rushing attack to an extent. I think you kind of really liked what you saw. So I think there is a piece like, yeah, you can build this offense around him. Again, I don't know that you're going to have a great passing attack under Thomas Castellanos, but you at least hopefully can run the ball relatively consistently and hopefully be able to like hit something big down the field, because you do have some wide receivers now who are kind of interesting in terms of what they can do.
We'll talk about those in a second. Here's the thing I'll throw at you. Thomas Castellanos just clearly helps you run the football when you have a guy like him. Well, guess what, Dill? I also really trust Gus Malzahn because he's got a long track record of bringing really good rushing attacks to wherever he goes. Thomas Castellanos with play action. 70% completion percentage, 7 touchdowns to 0 interceptions in the 2024 year. There's like this narrative that he got benched at Boston College and like wasn't good. He actually was not that bad of a quarterback for Boston College. It was a little bit of like we're trying to fit Thomas Castellanos into an offense with Bill O'Brien that it did the pieces weren't fitting together. But I don't think Thomas was bad. And if you can give him a run game and let him work off of play action, the numbers show that he's pretty damn good quarterback. Well, guess what? I trust Gus Malzahn to give him some sort of an offense, especially with the improved offensive line. Last thing you were talking about, proven pass catchers, Till, this is talk about another just insane conversation we had 12 months ago here. One, that we were here in the buzz, spring practice and fall camp about these wide receivers, man. I don't know where the buzz was coming, though. We weren't making it up. What we tricked ourselves into last year was it was all projection. Do you know who the most proven pass catcher in Florida State's wide receiver room was 12 months ago? It was Ja'Kai Douglas. Not a knock on Ja'Kai Douglas, but when he's your most proven guy going into a season, you know it's not good enough. And we were hoping guys like Akeem Williams or Malik Benson could step up. Now I look at it and say, you still have those guys that offer you some high upside. Like Akeem Williams, that he's still a guy that can make some things happen. Deuce Robinson has an infinite upside. I throw in Elijah Moore to that conversation as well. But what you also have here, guys like Squirrel White, guys that have shown they can do it at the Power 4 level, specifically in a conference like the SEC, you feel better about the pass catchers being better because, yeah, you have the ceiling. These guys that, hey, if they hit, they're going to hit. But you also have guys that are players, are ball players that can go and make some things happen on Saturdays. That's the difference between wide receiver room 12 months ago and the wide receiver room going into 2025.
Because it is also just simply more talented, because it's not like, again, there were like veteran pieces in that wide receiver room, but they weren't like hyper talented guys, I don't think, at the end of the day. You look, yeah, you got your proven pieces. You got your Squirrel Whites, Deuce Robinson's guy who's performed pretty well in the Big Ten for USC. But like Elijah Moore, Hakeem, and Lewayne McCoy are far more talented than most of the guys like your Dorian Williamsons and some of those other wide receivers on that team. So I think your floor is way higher, obviously, because you've just got guys who are more proven. But also, again, your top end is just simply better than what again, they were telling us those top end wide receivers were really good players. Like that obviously just wasn't true. Anybody you could watch, hands weren't reliable. They didn't run particularly good routes. It was like it just wasn't a great room. So again, like you look, I do think they have a pretty good combination because the fact that they were able to hold on to guys like Hakeem, Elijah Moore, Lewayne McCoy, and not let them like walk out the door, I find slightly encouraging. Because again, I do think those guys all, especially Hakeem and Lewayne, you've seen some kind of interesting things from both of
See,
them.
Elijah Moore is the guy I love going into 2025. Uh, and that's kind of the conversation that I think needs to be had more around Florida State going into 2025 is let's just ignore the ceiling for a little bit and let's just focus on like the floor just being much higher going into the 2025 year. Last thing that I love, Dill, they attacked the transfer portal in the front seven, specifically on the defensive line, with intent to fit what Tony White wants to do on defense. That 3-3-5, it's a funky defense. It requires certain defensive linemen to be successful. I want to start with this, getting Daryl Jackson back and holding on to Kevin Wynn. You need dominant nose play if you want to run a Tony White defense. That's really good. And yes, I'm putting some stock into a true freshman, Kevin Wynn. I think he's that guy. There's not many defensive linemen coming out of high school in this 2025 class that I think are more ready to play at the power four level than a guy like Kevin Wynn. But then you go out and look last year, they got so enamored with, a guy like Marvin Jones, where it's like you probably spent to get Marvin Jones to come to Florida State. Probably the budget on that was probably equal to Jason Jenkins, Deontay McCray, and DeMonte Diggs. Betting on a guy that, hey, we know has some upside, but you haven't really seen it. Well, guess what? Jason Jenkins, really solid football for Tennessee last year. Yes, he wasn't a starter, but he was getting worked into that rotation and playing well. Deontay McCray, you really like. I like DeMonte Diggs a lot. Two guys that fit too. Like they can play the 3-tech. They can play out there on the edge. Not only a revamped defensive line, but guys that can fit what Tony White wants to do and getting guys that can play ball versus last year's just so much projection like we just talked about in the wide receiver room as well.
Because I do think, again, I look at Daniel Lyons to me and Daryl Jackson, especially Daryl Jackson. He
He's
really
dog.
started to come on and like
Yeah.
play some dominant football, really.
Yes.
And you said it, like you saw how important if you go back and watch Nebraska, what Ty Robinson and Nash
Nash,
Hutmacher
yeah.
were to that team and how important they were. Like those are guys that I think Tony White kind of knows he needs that type of piece in that defense because it just doesn't work the same if you can't be physical in the middle. I look at Daryl Jackson again. Daniel Lyons a little bit more of a different player, a little bit more of a penetrator, but him, KJ Sampson, Kevin Wynn, like that group of three is going to be a really important piece of this defense.
Same conversation too that we had with the offensive line. Like, what is KJ Sampson or what is Daniel? What do these guys look like under Coach Knighton, who I think's a dude and did a great job with Nebraska? That's another exciting conversation. Better coaching staff, better players. Like, I mean, I know we just spent 18 minutes going up and down this roster, but if we were to simplify it, better coaching staff, better players is going to equal a better football team in the
And I
2025
like better players is like where it gets interesting because like you might look and say, well, it's not as talented of a team,
more
perhaps. You could
proven players,
maybe
maybe.
make that argument, but at least you have guys are
Yeah,
going to show up and like play good football like
yeah,
relatively
yeah,
consistently. Because
yeah.
as much as like Marvin Jones and even Patrick Payton to an extent, like yeah, they're talented players, but the inconsistency from those type of players, not just those two, but like really across the board, the offensive line certainly had that. The wide receiver room was clearly built that way. Like again, I don't know if the talent is better or worse. That's almost like hard to judge, but I do know that you just simply have better, more consistent football players at the end of the day.
Agreed. All right, we'll sign out there. Florida State, again, we're not saying national championship, but we are saying it's going to be a better team in the 2025 year. How much better? We will find out. A lot to talk about in spring practice. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.